Kimberly. The speech that I am refuting is Robert's claim that SOPA Stop Online Piracy Act is unconstitutional. And let me just say right now that I do believe SOPA is unconstitutional, but I don't believe that the idea of SOPA is as bad as we think. So Robert's first claim was SOPA violates the First Amendment. The first thing that's wrong with his evidence is that he cites only one site, Gizmodo, which is this opinion site that gives opinions about new gadgets to come out, like any new Apple product or whatnot, and just critiques them. One thing that's wrong with Gizmodo is that it's been known to be biased against Apple. So, and Apple is associated with the Business Software Association, which has come out to support SOPA. Also, Robert's argument is that it's violates the First Amendment, and that his reasoning is that it'll take away all the rights that we have. However, he doesn't state specifically what clause of the SOPA bill takes away that right or whatever. He's just making general claims about this and that and assumptions of what would happen, what won't happen. My counterclaim to this is that, yes, I do agree that SOPA does violate the First Amendment. However, I'm asking you guys to imagine why SOPA came about in the first place. I mean, piracy. The Institute for Policy Innovation claimed in 2007 estimated that the U.S. economy lost $12.5 billion just in music piracy alone, and that's a big chunk of our economy. I also believe that piracy creates this endless cycle where we download illegal music, and then that money that could go to the company creates that money that could go to the company does not provide enough money for them to create new stuff for us. It's just this endless cycle. His second claim is that SOPA would interfere with interstate commerce. The one thing that's wrong with his argument is that his evidence is that he doesn't provide any facts or anything of that sort. He just says it would. He doesn't say how SOPA would or not. He just says it would ban businesses from doing their business online. Again, he doesn't provide what types of business. I mean, he didn't say compared to a pornographic site, compared to this big company. We don't know, the audience doesn't know how it would affect either or company. There's no examples. Also, it's an ambiguous argument in that he reasons that it would interfere with interstate commerce, that it would be completely bad and it's a negative effect. However, my counterclaim is that just gives one side to how censorship it just gives a negative view of how censorship affects a country. I mean, if we look at China, their censorship is just as bad as how ours is, and we're not even censored yet, or if we are going to be, and their economy is just as good. Sarah Peters from enterpriseefficiency.com states that, that the censorship in China is paying off for their economy, while their businesses are bursting with new innovations. A lot of people wants that cut of the market. Censorship effectively keeps foreign competitors out of that market, and that boosts China's economy. His third claim is that SOPA would inhibit the creation and expansion of new ideas and intellectual property over the internet. While, my claim is, once again, he only states that one site, Gizmodo, that as his evidence, and it's, again, not a sufficient enough site. My claim is that SOPA, although it does regulate the internet, heavily regulate the internet, it protects intellectual property now and can in the future. And it doesn't it might prevent new ones from coming up, but completely preventing it altogether is just the big assumption that Robert made. In conclusion, Robert's argument isn't strong enough because he only has one site, such as Gizmodo and Wikipedia, and it seems like he did a lot of research on what SOPA is, but not about what the effects are. And I believe that SOPA, I believe SOPA is unconstitutional, but the idea of it is not, because piracy is one of the main things that in our economy that does affect, and that I believe that should be regulated, but with better legislation we can have agreement on both sides. Thank you.
Well, I don't know if you were here the other night when I said it to 2 or 3 people, but I'm going to say it again, as a counterclaim saying that, well, they're correct, they just didn't prove it. That's not a really convincing strategy to use. I don't think there's any reason why you have to argue that it is unconstitutional yourself. The question is, did the advocate prove that it's unconstitutional? That's the only thing that has to be resolved. You don't have to say that it is constitutional to reach that point, and I don't think that you're obligated to make that point, but I certainly don't think you're also obligated to say, yes, they're right, but they didn't do this, because it comes back to the same issue like we talked about before. Talk about a malpractice case. If you were the defense attorney for a criminal defendant, you said, well, the prosecution is right, my client is guilty, but they didn't really prove it. That's just not going to work very well as an appeal. So stick to the claim. So your basic claim on the first point is that the advocate didn't provide adequate evidence on this point. First of all, what's the standard for something being constitutional or not? Did the advocate give you a standard for what makes something constitutional? What source did they provide to suggest that it's unconstitutional? They provide a text source, not a legal source, to do this evaluation. Your criticism of the text source is that it's biased because it's got some issue with Apple, and Apple is potentially a supporter of these sorts of things. To me, the better argument is this is a source that the source that they're citing is a technology-based evaluation source. It is not a legal source. It doesn't have the qualifications for rendering a judgment about whether or not something meets the legal standard of constitutionally acceptable or prohibited. And I think that's the argument to be making on that particular point, not the one that says, that they're biased in some way. I don't think that gets you much traction at all. Then you come back and you say, here's my counterclaim, but it's not a counterclaim. It's basically, I agree with the point again. But there's another reason why we ought to have SOPA. Well, the argument that we ought to have SOPA is not an issue about whether or not it's constitutional. It's about whether or not there's a need for it. And I think that you do an okay job suggesting that there's a need for legislation like this, but whether or not there's a need for it concerns, is not the same factual dispute as whether or not it is constitutional. And so I think you need to go back to figuring out what the legal standard is on this point. Your transitions between the supporting points are very clear and easy to follow. I like the fact that you challenge the lack of specificity in the advocate's argument. You point out he doesn't identify what it is that SOPA does that would be unconstitutional, how it would result in this particular censorship. This seems to be a lot of hyperbole and a broad generalization, but there's no particulars here about what it does. And then then I think if you had any general evidence that suggested that the people who proposed it put it through a rigorous legal criteria in writing it, that they were careful to avoid anything that would constitute preemptive control of content, that sort of thing, I think that you'd have a good counter-argument on that point. I thought that your challenge on the third point about Gizmodo, I thought that was a little bit more appropriate than the one that you had on the first point, but then you come back to sounding like you're offering a critique instead of a conflict with the issue. And so it's well organized. I think you've got some good presses on the advocate's evidence and reasoning, but you undermine all of those arguments by consistently agreeing with their point, despite the fact that you're then going to tell us why they didn't prove their point. All right. Thank you.